My name is Naomi Carter. I'm 31 years old, and 2 hours before I was supposed to say I do, I was standing in a bridal suite staring at my reflection like I was looking at a woman who had already lost everything and just hadn't heard the final verdict yet. I was wearing a white silk gown that should have made me feel beautiful, lucky, chosen. Instead, I felt like I was being dressed for a public execution. Something had been wrong for weeks. The forced smiles, the whispered phone calls that stopped the second I walked into a room, the stack of documents I was told to sign because wedding season was hectic, and this would make everything easier later. I wanted to believe it was stress. I wanted to believe that families don't build traps for their own daughters. Then I heard my mother laughing in the hallway outside my room, low and sharp, like she was enjoying a private joke. A second later, I heard my father say that once this was done, I would never see what they took coming. My hand slipped off the vanity. My whole body went cold. In that moment, I realized I wasn't walking toward a marriage. I was walking into a setup. They were going to leave me at the altar, humiliate me in front of everyone, and use the fallout to cover a scam that had been building behind my back for months. And the worst part was not the money. It was hearing my own mother say I deserved it. What they didn't know was that I had stopped being naive a long time ago. So while they were getting ready to make me the fool of the day, I was getting ready to turn their perfect wedding into the last mistake they'd ever make. Before I tell you what I heard next and what happened when I finally walked down that aisle, tell me what time it is where you are and where you're watching from, because I have a feeling this story is going to travel a lot farther than that wedding ever did. The second the voices faded down the hallway, I locked the door and stood there trying to breathe without shaking apart. A soft knock came a moment later, and when I opened it, Jenna Morales stepped inside with my phone in one hand and a paper coffee cup in the other. Jenna had been my best friend since college, and because she worked weddings for a living, very little rattled her. But one look at my face wiped the smile off hers. She asked me what happened, and I told her everything I had just heard. I repeated every word as clearly as I could, even the part where my mother laughed, even the part where my father said I would never see what they took coming. Jenna did not interrupt. She just listened, set the coffee down, and shut the curtains like she was closing us inside a war room. Then she asked the question that changed everything. She asked me whether I had proof or only suspicion. That was when I reached into the bottom of my bag and pulled out the silver flash drive I had been carrying for 3 weeks. I told her I had stopped trusting my parents the day my father pushed a stack of legal papers across his office desk and told me not to waste his time reading them. He said they were routine estate adjustments before the wedding. He said it was just family housekeeping. He said if I loved this family, I would sign and stop acting difficult. I signed 2 of them. But I took photos first. Then I sent copies to Ethan Cole, an attorney I had known since my senior year of college. Ethan reviewed them and called me back the same night. He said the wording was slippery enough to scare him. Some clauses could be used later to argue that control over parts of my trust and voting shares should move into temporary family management. Temporary, in my father's language, usually meant forever. After that, I started paying attention. I noticed private meetings I was excluded from. I noticed my mother suddenly asking questions about the trust Grandma left me. I noticed how often my father said marriage changes things financially, as if he was rehearsing a line he wanted me to accept, before he used it on me for real. So I did something my family never expected me to do. I prepared. Jenna stared at the flash drive and asked what was on it. I told her it held audio clips, copied emails, scanned documents, and security footage from a small camera I had installed in the home office I used whenever I visited my parents' house. I had told everyone it was for work calls because I managed luxury event launches and high-profile client weekends. No one questioned why I liked having control over a room. That room ended up giving me everything. I had recordings of my father discussing debt pressure, tax exposure, and ways to move assets without triggering attention too early. I had my mother asking whether the wedding crowd would include the right people from the board and from our investors. I had enough to know this was not some emotional outburst or family misunderstanding. This was a plan. Jenna looked at me for a long second, then she asked what I wanted to do. I told her the wedding video team was still waiting on a supposed surprise montage. I wanted her to hand them this drive and tell them I had changed the presentation order. She did not even blink. She just nodded. Then I texted Ethan one sentence: "Lock everything down now." Less than a minute later, he replied that the emergency trust protections were already moving and that he was on his way to the venue. That should have made me feel safe. Instead, it made everything more real. My parents were not bluffing. They were about to turn my wedding into a cover for theft and humiliation. Jenna stepped closer, squeezed my shoulders, and told me to look at her. She said if they wanted a show, they were about to get one they would never recover from. 10 minutes later, I was standing in a private dressing room off the ballroom, staring at Jenna's tablet while my pulse slammed in my ears. She had synced another folder Ethan had just sent over from the file copies I gave him. There were bank statements I had never seen, transfers between corporate accounts and a shell company in Arizona, and one email chain that made my stomach twist so hard I had to grab the edge of the table. My father had written that the ceremony needed to go exactly as planned because once Naomi is publicly destabilized, the board will back emergency consolidation. Publicly destabilized. That was the phrase he used about his daughter on her wedding day. My mother had replied that embarrassment would keep me too emotional to think clearly, and that afterward they could frame any protest from me as stress, panic, or a breakdown. I read that line 3 times. Then I laughed once, not because it was funny, but because it was so cold that for a second it did not feel real. The woman who taught me how to set a Thanksgiving table and choose thank you cards had helped draft a strategy for destroying me in public. Another attachment showed tax correspondence marked urgent and a memo about unpaid obligations tied to one of the Carter development properties. It clicked into place so fast it made me sick. They were not just after my inheritance. They needed my trust, my shares, and my silence because they were cornered. The wedding was not only a family celebration, it was a stage set for an extraction. A knock sounded, and before I could hide the tablet, my mother stepped in. Up close, she looked flawless in a pale blue gown, every strand of blonde hair pinned perfectly, every diamond placed exactly where it should be. That had always been her talent. She knew how to make destruction look elegant from a distance. She smiled too quickly and asked whether I was having nerves. I asked her whether there was anything she wanted to tell me before I walked down the aisle. Her smile faltered, but only for a second. Then she told me this day was emotional for everyone and that families sometimes had to make hard choices for the greater good. That phrase again. Not love, not honesty. The greater good. I asked her whether the greater good included moving my grandmother's money into accounts I never approved. I asked whether it included forged resolutions and emergency control language buried inside wedding week paperwork. Her face changed then. Not enough for someone who did not know her, but enough for me. My mother had a way of going still when she was caught. She sat down slowly and said my father was under a lot of pressure. She said the company was vulnerable. She said investors were impatient. She said that after the wedding, everything could have been smoothed out quietly, and I would still have been taken care of. Taken care of. That was the moment I knew I was done with both of them. People who love you do not talk about stealing from you like it is a practical compromise. I told her that if she had come in there to warn me, she was too late. If she had come in there to defend him, she should save her breath. Her eyes filled, but I had no idea whether those tears were guilt or fear. Before she could answer, my phone buzzed with a message from Adrian Wells. He wrote that he loved me, that he knew wedding mornings were chaos, and that whatever happened today, He was on my side. I stared at that text longer than I should have. Adrian was not part of this. That mattered more than I could explain. I texted back that I loved him too, and that I needed him to trust me for a little while longer. Then Ethan texted, "Assets secured. Emergency trust protections active. Investigators informed. Use your judgment." I looked at my mother and asked her one last question. I asked whether she knew my father planned to leave me humiliated at the altar before taking what he could not win honestly. She did not answer. She only whispered that everything had gone too far. I told her she was right. Then I stood up, smoothed the front of my dress, and said it was time for someone to finally let it go all the way. By the time the photographer called for family portraits, I felt strangely calm, and that calm seemed to unsettle my father more than tears ever could have. Douglas Carter had spent my whole life reading rooms, managing people, and crushing resistance before it fully formed. He was good at sensing weakness. What he was not good at was recognizing when the person he thought he controlled had stopped being afraid of him. We lined up in the garden outside the ballroom with white roses climbing the stone wall behind us and a string quartet warming up in the distance. If anyone had taken a photo from far enough away, we would have looked like the picture-perfect Chicago family people had admired for years. Wealthy parents, successful daughter, beautiful wedding. But up close, every smile felt like a threat. My father placed a hand on my back and leaned in just enough to murmur that I should remember this moment because life could change fast when people forgot who built it for them. I turned my head and smiled like he had told a charming joke. Then I asked whether he had practiced that speech, or whether cruelty came naturally to him. For the first time all day, I saw uncertainty flicker behind his eyes. Good. Let him wonder. After the portraits, Jenna found me near the side entrance and pulled me into a linen room for 30 seconds of privacy. She told me the AV team had the file queued, the screens were tested, and audio was clean. Ethan had arrived. 2 financial crimes investigators and 1 federal liaison were waiting off-site until he gave the signal. I asked about Adrian. She said Ethan had quietly asked him to stay close to the ceremony entrance and not react too fast if something unexpected happened. Adrian had not liked the secrecy, but he agreed because he trusted me. That nearly broke me more than anything else. Trust from the right person always hurts when you have just lost it from the people who were supposed to give it first. As Jenna turned to leave, I heard voices through the partly open service door that led toward the library corridor. My father was inside with my mother. They sounded tense. My mother said I was too calm, and that maybe they should postpone. My father snapped that there was no postponing anything because the board papers were already in motion, and the wedding crowd gave them cover. Then he said the line that made every piece lock into place. He said once she is embarrassed in front of everyone, she will either fold or lash out, and either way, we win. I held my breath so hard it hurt. My own parents were not just planning to take my assets. They were counting on public humiliation to weaken me enough to make the rest easy. That was the part I needed. Not for me, for everyone else. People can dismiss greed. They can rationalize family conflict. But when they hear parents calmly discussing how to break their daughter in front of 200 guests, that becomes something uglier, something unforgettable. I recorded as much as I could, then stepped back before they opened the door. A minute later, I found Ethan waiting in a side hallway, sharp in a dark suit, legal folder under one arm, expression unreadable in that lawyer way of his. I gave him my phone and told him I had one more clip. He listened with his jaw tightening, then handed it back, and said this was no longer merely defensive. This was decisive. He walked me through the final sequence one more time. My trust and shares were protected. Any transfer argument my father tried to make would fail. The documents we had copied were enough to trigger deeper scrutiny. If the public exposure happened first, The investigators would have probable cause to move fast. He asked whether I was absolutely sure. I looked toward the ballroom doors, toward the people already taking their seats for what they thought would be a lavish family wedding, and I said yes. Not because I wanted revenge more than peace, but because people like my parents depend on peace being more convenient than truth. Then Jenna appeared again and told me they were ready to line me up for the aisle. I took one last breath, adjusted my veil, and said the words that had been building in me all morning. If they want a spectacle, let's make sure it belongs to me. The music started softly at first, then rose through the ballroom as the doors opened and every guest stood. I could feel all those eyes land on me at once, the admiration, the expectation, the soft collective sigh people make when they think they are witnessing something beautiful. The ballroom at the Lake Forest estate looked exactly the way I had designed it. Candlelight shimmered along mirrored tables. White orchids framed the aisle. Crystal chandeliers threw warm light over hundreds of polished faces. It should have felt magical. Instead, it felt like stepping onto a stage where I finally knew the script the other actors had been hiding from me. My father stood at my side, offering me his arm. He smiled for the crowd like a man proud to give his daughter away. I took his arm because I wanted him close when it happened. We moved down the aisle slowly. I saw Adrian at the altar, handsome and steady and confused. Only in the normal way a groom looks nervous before vows. That grounded me. Whatever else this day became, one thing in that room was still real. When we reached the front, my father kissed my cheek for appearances. His lips were cold. The officiant welcomed everyone and began the first lines of the ceremony. Then, just as planned on their side, my father interrupted. He did it with a heavy sigh, like a man burdened by truth. He turned toward the guests and said he could not in good conscience allow this wedding to go forward. The room shifted instantly. People leaned forward. Murmurs started. Adrian looked at him in disbelief. I did not move. My father said painful realities had come to light about my judgment and my fitness to carry the responsibilities attached to the Carter name. He said love could not repair recklessness. He said sometimes a family had to make a devastating decision to protect itself. Then my mother stepped forward beside him. I will remember the look on her face for the rest of my life. Not rage, not sadness, satisfaction. She looked almost relieved to finally stop pretending. She stared right at me, let out a short laugh, and said, "You deserve this, idiot." A sound moved through the room then, not quite a gasp, not quite silence, something ugly and shocked in between. That was the moment they thought I would break. That was the moment they believed the humiliation itself would do half the work for them. Adrian said my name and took a step toward me, but I lifted one hand slightly, asking him, without words, to wait. My mother kept talking. She said I had brought this on myself. My father announced that after the ceremony was formally halted, the family would handle all related legal and financial matters privately and responsibly. Privately, responsibly. Those men always love those words when they mean the exact opposite. I looked out over the crowd. Business associates, charity board members, family friends, people who had spent years telling me how lucky I was to come from such a powerful family. And there I was, in white silk at the altar, being dismissed like an inconvenience. For one suspended second, I understood exactly how many women before me had stayed quiet, because moments like this are designed to crush you into silence. Then I smiled. It was not a big smile. It was not dramatic. It was just enough to make my father's expression shift from triumph to confusion. I took the microphone from the officiant's stand before anyone could stop me. My voice came out calm and clear. I said my parents left me at the altar after their scam, but they had no idea what came next. Then I turned toward the screens on either side of the ballroom and said, "Welcome to the real show." At the back of the room, Jenna gave the signal. The lights dimmed slightly. The first screen flickered alive. My father's face lost color before the audio even started. On the screen, his voice filled the ballroom. He was discussing emergency consolidation, my trust, public embarrassment, and timing. My mother was in the recording too, asking whether I would be too emotional afterward to challenge anything effectively. Someone in the crowd actually said, "Oh my God," out loud. Adrian stepped back from the altar, not away from me but away from them, like the truth had physically redrawn the map of the room. My father lunged toward the technician station, but security blocked him. My mother kept saying, "Turn it off. Turn it off." Only her voice sounded smaller each time. The second clip played. Tax exposure, shell transfers, pressure before the board review. The plan to use my wedding crowd as social cover for a narrative that I was unstable and unfit. Phones appeared everywhere around the ballroom. Dozens of guests were recording now. A few people I recognized from our investors' circle looked sick. One of the board members did not even try to hide his horror. Then came the final clip, the one from the library corridor only an hour earlier. My father saying once she is embarrassed in front of everyone, she will either fold or lash out, and either way, we win. I did not need to say another word after that. The room had already chosen what it believed. My mother looked at me like she had never seen me before. Good. Let her learn what happens when the daughter she underestimated stops standing still. Chaos did not explode all at once. It spread in waves. First the silence after the third clip ended, then the whispering, then the sharp rise of voices from guests, asking whether the recordings were real, whether the papers were real, whether Carter Development was under investigation. My father tried to regain control the only way men like him know how. He pointed at me and said, "This was a performance stitched together out of context by a hysterical bride." He said I was emotional, vindictive, confused. But even as he spoke, Ethan walked down the side aisle and onto the front platform with the kind of composure that makes liars panic. He introduced himself clearly, stated that he represented my legal interests, and informed the room that my trust and voting shares had been secured under emergency protection that morning due to credible evidence of fraud and coercive transfer attempts. He held up a sealed packet and said copies of supporting material had already been provided to the appropriate authorities. That was when my father stopped talking for the first time in my life. My mother grabbed his arm so hard her bracelet snapped. Adrian came to my side then. He did not ask me why. He did not ask whether this was true. He simply stood next to me, close enough for everyone to see where he had chosen to stand. That mattered. It made what my parents had staged collapse in a second direction, too. They had wanted the image of a bride rejected. Instead, they got the image of a daughter exposed and a couple refusing to be manipulated. The ballroom doors opened and 3 investigators entered with venue security. They were not theatrical about it. They did not need to be. Real authority rarely performs when the evidence already has. One of them asked Douglas Carter and Elaine Carter to step aside for questioning regarding financial fraud, document irregularities, and possible misuse of trust-related assets. My father laughed the way cornered people laugh when they still think arrogance can substitute for innocence. He asked whether anyone knew who he was. The lead investigator answered that yes, they did. And that was exactly why they were there. Guests moved back to clear space. Some looked stunned. Some looked fascinated. A few looked relieved, which told me more than I expected. Powerful people do not only create fear, they create quiet resentment in those forced to flatter them. The moment they fall, you can see how many people were waiting for gravity to finish the job. My mother began to cry then, but even that did not sound sincere. It sounded frightened. She kept saying she had only done what she thought was necessary to save the family. I finally spoke again. I told her that families are not saved by sacrificing the child with the most to lose. I told my father that if he had needed money, he could have asked. If he had needed help, he could have told the truth. But he had wanted more than rescue. He had wanted obedience. He had wanted to teach me that everything I owned, even my future, still belonged to him if he decided it did. One of the board members stepped forward from the front table and asked Ethan whether the allegations involving company funds were credible. Ethan answered that based on the documents presently available, credible was the mildest word he would use. That broke the room open even wider. Phones kept rising, voices kept spreading. Someone from one of the city charity boards turned away from my mother entirely, refusing to meet her eyes. My father attempted one last move. He said none of this could be proven and that private family conversations were not crimes. Ethan replied that forged signatures, concealed transfers, shell accounts, coercive paperwork, and tax deception were not merely conversations. Then he handed the lead investigator a second folder. My father saw that folder and went pale in a way no person can fake. He knew what was in it: the copied drafts, the estate language, the board memo, the shell company trail. Jenna stepped up to me and whispered that every screen in the venue had automatically backed up the footage to cloud storage. There would be no taking it back now. I almost laughed. My parents had spent years believing the only person in the family who understood staging was them. They forgot I built my career on controlling what rooms see and when they see it. As the investigators escorted my parents toward the side exit, my father twisted around and called me ungrateful. My mother asked how I could do this to my own family. That was the question that nearly ignited me. I told them they had asked the wrong question all day. The real question was how they had done this to their own daughter and still expected me to protect them from the consequences. The ballroom went dead silent again after that. Adrian took my hand, and for the first time since morning I let myself feel it. Warm, steady, real. My dress still rustled when I breathed. The flowers still smelled sweet. The chandeliers were still bright over a room that had just watched one family destroy itself in public. Then I looked at the guests and said the reception was still happening, only now it would be a celebration of the truth. And somehow, after everything, people started clapping. The strangest part of that day was not watching my parents lose control. It was watching what happened after. Once the first shock wore off, the room changed. People who had been frozen in their chairs came up to me one by one. Some apologized for ever believing my parents' version of us. Some admitted they had seen little things over the years and ignored them because Douglas Carter was powerful and Elaine Carter was polished. And no one likes being the first person to say something is wrong inside a rich family. Ethan stayed close, moving between guests, investigators, and board members, with the calm efficiency of someone making sure the truth did not slip through procedural cracks. Jenna somehow turned a ruined wedding reception into the cleanest crisis pivot I had ever seen. She had the bar staff keep serving drinks, the band hold soft music, and the florist move arrangements so the front of the ballroom no longer looked like a crime scene in couture. Adrian and I stood together near the dance floor while the board chair quietly informed Ethan that an emergency review of Carter Development would begin immediately. By sunset, company accounts connected to the questionable transfers were under review, outside counsel had been brought in, and the same people who once treated my father like the sun itself were suddenly speaking about him in the past tense. That was the thing about false power. It looks permanent until the evidence arrives. My mother sent 2 messages that night through her attorney. The first said she had never wanted it to happen like this. The second said she hoped one day I would understand the pressure she had been under. I did not answer either one. Some apologies are not really apologies. They are just another way of asking the victim to carry the discomfort for everyone else. Adrian and I did not get married that day. There was too much smoke in the air, even after the fire had done necessary work. But he did stay. He sat beside me long after the guests left. After the staff cleared half-melted candles and untouched slices of wedding cake, and he told me that what I had done was not cruel. It was brave. I do not know if I believed that yet, but I held on to the words anyway. In the weeks that followed, more details surfaced. My father's debt exposure was worse than even Ethan had suspected. The forged paperwork tied into a pattern of financial manipulation that reached beyond me. My mother lost every charitable position she had spent years polishing into social armor. People stopped returning their calls. Invitations disappeared. Their circle did what elite circles always do when scandal becomes undeniable. It pretended distance had always existed. As for me, I took control of what was legally mine and refused to inherit what was morally broken. I worked with Ethan and the restructured board to open a restitution review for people harmed by the company's deceptive practices. I also funded a small education initiative in my grandmother's name focused on financial literacy, legal awareness, and coercive control inside families, because that was the lesson I could not stop thinking about. The deepest damage in stories like mine does not begin with stolen money. It begins when love is used as leverage and obedience is mistaken for loyalty. People need to know that being family does not give anyone the right to deceive you, control your assets, shame you into silence, or weaponize your trust. They need to know that understanding contracts matters, asking questions matters, documentation matters, boundaries matter, and speaking up before abuse becomes tradition matters most of all. I still think about that moment at the altar sometimes, the one where my mother smiled and thought she had broken me. What she did not understand was that humiliation only works when the target accepts the shame. I gave the shame back to the people who earned it. And if there is any good thing I can leave behind from that day, it is this. Truth may cost you comfort in the beginning, but lies cost far more in the end. Self-respect is not selfish. Knowledge is not disloyalty. Protecting yourself is not cruelty. Sometimes the most meaningful thing you can do for yourself and for other people watching in silence is to draw a line and refuse to let anyone, even your own blood, step over it again.